It is my great pleasure to introduce Scott Campbell, who is in the Department of Communication Studies here. Those of you who are in SI may not realize this, but the Communication Studies Department occupies the 5th and 6th floors right above us. And there's a whole department there that is as interested in digital media as we are. And Scott is one of the pioneers of scholars who studied mobile communication. He worked previously at Sprint before he decided that he was interested in academia, and he's been the Poe's professor of telecommunication for quite some time, and he's going to talk to us today about some theories he's thinking about with mobile technology.
Okay, thank you. I first want to thank Kentaro for inviting me to come here, and I want to thank the School of Information, and I want to thank everyone who's giving up their lunch hour to come listen to this talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So this kind of started, I guess, when Kentaro and I had a chance to kind of get together for the first time after he came to Michigan, and we were having lunch over at Sava's, and he asked me if I would be willing to do this. And I was like, sure, what would you like me to do? And I think his response word for word was, I'd like you to give us your take on mobile communication. All right, so I was, okay, my take on mobile communication. So to try to fulfill that goal, what I've decided I'm going to do today is cover a lot of ground, because I want to have something that is there for everyone who might be interested in mobile communication. And there are a lot of different facets of it. So I won't be covering a lot of ground today, so that means I might have to move kind of quickly through some of the concepts, but I'll save some time for Q&A so that we can come back and dive into some things if you have questions. The other thing I want to do today is I want to try to speak to both the academic interest in mobile communication, specifically theoretical developments in my field, but at the same time, I want there to be some everyday life appeal to this talk. I want to make this accessible to people who maybe don't study mobile communication at all, who've never read an article on mobile communication scholarship, but we all experience it, right? I assume everybody, if this is, like the rest of the world, everybody in this room has got a mobile phone, and if they don't, then I'd like to talk to you after this talk and do some research on it. That's fascinating. Also, I want to take this as an opportunity to workshop some ideas. I've got some new things that I'm working on right now, a new project, so I consider this to be hopefully a friendly crowd where I can throw some things out there and see what sticks, and throw some things out there and see what I might need to revisit. And then finally, one of my goals for this talk is to try to avoid the pitfalls of the utopian, dystopian conversation that I think we see a lot of times. Hopefully you'll see that I'm going to give kind of a balanced perspective, some things that we can, I guess I use this word softly, but celebrate about mobile communication, and also some things that we might need to be a little bit concerned with. So hopefully you'll see a balanced approach here. Okay. As far as an overview of the things I am going to cover today, first I'm going to talk about what mobile communication is, what my definition of mobile communication is, and why mobile communication matters. Then I want to present two theoretical streams, overarching streams. Within that, there are kind of some sub-streams of theory. This is a new field. It's an emerging field. It's really only been kind of coming on as its own area of study over the last decade or so. We're still seeing the predominant amount of research on good old-fashioned feature phones because the publication lag is so long, and so we're still trying to catch up to what's going on in the technological world and in the social world. And for that reason, we're kind of at a point in the field where it's a good time to take a step back now that we're about a decade into it, and kind of try to identify the theories that are out there, or the theoretical arguments. Maybe they're not formal theories, but it's movement in a theoretical direction that are shaping the field, shaping the research, shaping the kinds of questions that people are asking. So I'm going to try to do that today, and I'm going to try to kind of organize things and sort of put them in conversation with one another. And then finally, I want to talk about some implications. And this is where I think the everyday life application might come into play for you. Implications for how and how much we're socially connected. But also, on the other side of the coin, I want to talk about some implications for solitude, which is something that is largely kind of ignored or understudied in most disciplines. Certainly in communication, we have a preference for really focusing on the connecting as opposed to the disconnecting. And I think that mobile communication has really important implications for both. Okay, so what is mobile communication? My definition of mobile communication is that it is the possibility, this is a really important word, the possibility of mediated social interaction, media consumption, information exchange, while the user is physically in motion. I'm not saying, so this is a process definition. It's not a device. I'm not married to a device. If I was married to this thing that we hold around in our hands, I think that my trajectory would get stale pretty quickly. So it's a process definition, and it's not just what we do with the technology, it's the possibility that we can do this. And the reason why I flag possibility of mobile communication, like right now, I'm experiencing mobile communication. I've got a cell phone on me, could use it. Actually, I couldn't, I turned it off for the talk. But you know what I mean. The possibility generates a set of expectations that I will argue in this talk have become embedded in our social structure and have become embedded in our very psychology of the self. Now this may take place through voice, text, picture, video, otherwise. It used to be that the traditional landline cell phone was voice, text, voicemail, and then eventually picture sharing. Now we've got a whole new world of affordances through smartphones. One thing I want to point out is that we still see the reports and the data that I'm seeing today still suggests that the number one thing that people are doing with the technology today is point-to-point messaging, point-to-point contact, or even calling is still high on the list. It may not be text messaging via SMS, it might be more towards applications and IM, but still the number one thing that people rely on the technology for is this interpersonal communication, which tends to happen with our core ties. So even though there's a whole new world of possibilities out there and we do use the technology for a lot of things, I still think that this good old-fashioned interpersonal contact is important, and it's not something that we want to lose sight of for reasons that I'll explain in the talk. So getting back to my earlier point about possibility, it's not that the device is necessarily used while you're on the go, but that it's possible to use it, that you can use it anytime, virtually anytime, anywhere. I think it's on the next slide where I talk about, yes, distinctions between portability and fixed. And so it's a lot of times our mobile technology use is used like a fixed medium, like the computer. Maybe we use it at home in one solitary place, one single place where we're sitting or something, or maybe we carry it around like a laptop. But the point is that we can use it while we're moving around. We can use it while we're taking care of everyday life activities. And this is one of the things that's distinctive about the technology. Some other things that are distinctive about the technology: unprecedented adoption rates. This is just a quick graphic of that. We've never seen another communication channel take off like this on the planet ever in our history. I think one of the best ways of illustrating this is by looking at the adoption rates, comparing adoption rates of just internet access in general between developing societies and wealthy societies, and then looking at that same gap between in the mobile world. And what you see is that there's a huge gap. There's, I think, and Kentaro can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're looking at something like maybe 35% internet access in the developing world, and maybe 80% or something like that in the developed world. And then when it comes to mobile, we're talking about a much narrow gap. We're talking about something like 80% in developing, or 90% in many places in the developing world, and 100% or over 100% in the developed world if we're looking at subscriptions. So we haven't seen anything like this before, and it's a global phenomenon. It's also distinctive in the way that it has implications for how we relate to space. In what I would call the Wave 1.0 mobile research, people who were studying mobile communication and space were largely interested in what we might call absent presence, the way that the technology cuts us off from space and from other people in those spaces. I would say that Wave 2.0 research is looking at it very differently now and saying, no, it's actually connecting us to spaces in new and important ways through location-based services and geotagging, and people are using the technology to allow us to utilize public spaces as hubs of social activity. My point is simply that mobile communication, the possibility of using it anytime, anywhere, is what gives rise to this debate in the first place. Size matters, right? The fact that it's small means that it can be with us anytime, anywhere. We can wear it, we can put it in our pocket. It's something that's easy to have anytime. Cost matters, it's cheap. The infrastructure is cheaper than landline. The technology itself, you can get a cheap handset. This is why we see adoption rates in the developing world. Also, pay plans make it affordable for many people. In the United States, we tend to have these really expensive all-you-can-eat plans, monthly plans with many people on there, and it's like your cable bill, where it's a couple $100 a month or something. But in other parts of the world, it's affordable because of pay-as-you-go. And if you run out of your credits, you run out for a while. Maybe you use somebody else's phone, or you make other arrangements like beeping, where it's sort of you call and you hang up, and that means something, and then you get some money and you re-up your plan. And in terms of another distinction here, which I flagged earlier, portability and mobility are two different things. Portability, you're carrying something around, and then you're tethered to a place. You're setting it down. You need the infrastructure. You need the surface to set your device on, to use it, or you might need to log on to a network or something like that. This offers a lot of flexibility. But mobility is different. Mobility is where you can use it in the flows, in the rhythms of everyday life activity. And that has theoretical and practical importance, as I'll talk about. If anybody has any questions or complaints or comments, you can interrupt me at any time, but we will try to save some time. Okay, so the first theoretical stream I want to engage with is the question, and I've come up with this, and I'm still kind of working on how to make this accessible to people, but the question of reaching in at the expense of reaching out. There's a collection of arguments. All of these are making the same fundamental argument. I'm not going to unpack them fully here. I wouldn't have time because I want to cover other theoretical streams, but they're all making the argument, and they're all originally rooted in the feature phone of the 2G era, where we were talking about solely point-to-point contact. But they're all making the argument that mobile communication strengthens our core ties at the expense of reaching out beyond our core ties. I have just a couple of quick quotes just to illustrate this argument for you, and then I'm going to present some research in a contrasting perspective. Okay, so Ling, 2008, Rich Ling, has this concept of bounded solidarity. Here's a quote that illustrates bounded solidarity. We see that there is a tightening in the individual social network that augurs against those who are marginally known to us and in favor of those who are familiar. That is, we are perhaps seeing the development of bounded solidarity, the potential for the clique to be so focused on its own interactions that the so-called weak link connections are neglected. Telecocooning comes out of some research in Japan. This is an extension on some of the work that Higuchi has done. Kobayashi and Bose say in one of their more recent articles, quote, "The resources people have to spend on personal communication are finite, which can lead to the strengthening of existing strong ties at the expense of interactions with others who are less familiar." And if I were to unpack these perspectives, what we would see is this: the contours of social withdrawal. I guess we can call this the social withdrawal perspective. We're withdrawing from society broadly into our little cocoons of core ties through perpetual contact. The contours are less contact with diverse ties, less contact with weak ties, less contact or development of new ties, and then also less engagement in civic life and political life. So those are the specific contours. If you were to read all of these articles, you would pull all those things out. And my interpretation is that we can put these things together and kind of conceptualize them as a sphere, where our core ties are inside of the sphere, and all of those things I mentioned are on the outside of the sphere. And what we have is a zero-sum game argument. We have an argument that the ties are strengthened inside that sphere of our core networks at the expense of reaching out beyond them. That's why I call it reaching in at the expense of reaching out. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's some more. Now these are kind of like armchair theories in a way, right? These are arguments, and they've shaped it. They're meaningful because they've shaped research questions. There's the telecocooning hypothesis that we see in multiple publications and stuff. But in a sense, they're kind of like people just initially trying to figure out how to make sense of this technology. There's no question that mobile communication strengthens our core ties. But I do think that there's a question about this zero-sum proposition. Does it actually do so in a way that takes away from our engagement outside of them? So I'll share with you a little bit of the work that I've done in this area. After I present the alternative perspective. Within this question of reaching in at the expense of reaching out, we see that there's a new perspective that came out in a book by Barry Wellman and Lee Rainey in 2012. It's about networked individualism. Some of you may know who Barry Wellman is. He's a sociologist at the University of Toronto, but he's now in their iSchool. And he's been working with networked individualism as a theory for a long time, and he's added mobile communication to it. And now, in 2012, they're reflecting on the shift towards smartphones, right? And 3 and soon to be 4G data streams and enhanced affordances and social media access and apps and going out online to the internet, all these kinds of things. And what their argument is that mobile communication is a newly added layer of connection in all social domains. Not just inside to our core ties, definitely to our core ties, but everywhere, including weak ties, diverse ties, new ties, and fluid participation in civic and political involvement. I probably, for the sake of time and being able to have a Q&A, won't go too far into this, but what they're saying here visually with this, which I probably am violating some sort of copyright, is that we're moving from a world of little boxes where we are in static groups that are kind of defined by geography, neighborhoods, towards a model that looks like this, a more networked model. And they're saying in this networked model that we are able to pursue our individual interests, that we can connect with people based on those interests, not based on the space that we share. And as a result, it allows us to connect with diverse, weak, new ties in the civic realm, in the political realm, everywhere. So we have, I would say, within the question of reaching in at the expense of reaching out, we have on the one hand social withdrawal into core ties, which was rooted in 2G technology, but it still thrives today. It still shows up in the research today. It shapes, it has an influence on the questions people are asking. And now I'm going to call this the added layer, the newly added layer, so that it's added communication in all aspects of our lives. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. One of those arguments from this social withdrawal perspective was made by Ken Gergen at Swarthmore, and he's calling his argument monadic clusters. I think he's playing on the word nomadic here and mobile, so monadic clusters. And his argument, his theoretical argument, is that essentially there's a recipe for political disaster brewing in our culture today. And this recipe contains 3 things, 3 components. First of all, we have intensive mobile communication with our core ties. All the theoretical arguments share that from the social withdrawal perspective. He says that also that we're moving towards a smaller enclave of core ties, and that those ties tend to be like-minded. And that what we have is this kind of these are the 3 ingredients in the recipe. So we have sort of circular affirmation with a small number of individuals that we're in perpetual contact with. And we're agreeing with one another because we tend to be somewhat homophilous with our core ties. And essentially what we're doing is, this is the environment in which our political discourse is increasingly taking place. That's what he's saying. It's not just political discourse. We talk about the color of our shoelaces. We need help making little mundane decisions in daily life because we can get that help now at any time, right, from our core ties. So it's not just about political discourse, but it is becoming, he says, the sphere in which political discourse takes place. And that sphere, that monadic cluster, is the combination of intense communication with core ties, small number of core ties, and folks are like-minded, and they're reinforcing each other's position. And what that ultimately leads to, he says, is two trajectories. One of them is political detachment, and one of them is dialogic disruption. Political detachment means that you're losing interest in, you don't care as much, or you don't feel the need to go out and get involved, to go to rallies and stuff like that. Dialogic disruption, he says, means that you're closing off your political dialogue with people that you don't know very well, because you're so engrossed with the people you do know so well. Does that make sense? Okay. So I did some empirical work on this. I did a longitudinal survey, and I looked at, these are just basically his recipe here. I kind of tested it, essentially. In the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of move through this quickly and just say, you know, there's publications if you want to read them for the details, but it's a longitudinal survey. Those are all the variables, you know, predictor variable, and then the recipe is made up of mobile phone use to talk about politics, not just to talk about any kind of exchange. It could be through social media, it could be text, it could be voice. That was how I designed the question, was any form of political exchange with your core ties. We also operationalized the size of your core ties and the like-mindedness of your core ties, and we controlled for a bunch of stuff, including the first wave of data, so we could make some causal claims. And we had a representative survey with 3 waves between 2008 and 2010, good response rates, quite a few people providing the power to find significant results. And this is what I want to draw your attention to. The red line, this red line at the top. This is Gergen's recipe, all right? We see a slight decline here for high like-minded plus high mobile contact with core ties and smaller networks. That's the 3-part recipe. We do see a tiny little decline here in terms of political involvement, right? This is supporting, very subtle support for what he's arguing, not much. If we look at the 3-way interaction, though, for the larger networks, it's the same recipe. Like-mindedness is high, mobile use is high, but we're looking at larger networks, right? That's one twist in his recipe. And we see a dramatic rise, actually, an increase in political involvement over time that is much more pronounced than this tiny little decrease up here. So what it does is it actually is telling a different kind of story here, that under certain circumstances, mobile communication can foster increased political involvement, but it really depends on the context of its use.
Can you just give us an idea of what constitutes small versus large in this?
Yeah, maybe 7 people. Standard deviation above and below. Large is a standard deviation above, and I think it was 7 or 8.
Okay, just
Yeah.
trying to get a sense of scale.
Yeah. And then we see the same pattern here for dialogic disruption. This means talking about politics with people that you don't know. How many conversations you had, I think in the last month or something like that, maybe 2 months. And we see this red line down here is the same pattern of increased open dialogue under certain conditions with the larger networks. And this is pretty flat. This is Gergen's recipe right here. Yeah.
Is this emphasizing national politics, or what level?
No, just politics in general, but it was done before and after the 2008 election for short-term effects, and then we did it again a year and a half later for long-term effects.
So like with this,
Any political exchange at all.
so it could just be like a student government, or like it could be like a small scale.
It's not just about politics, it's also about public affairs. It could be about any news. You're talking about any type of politics or public affairs. And not just talking, it could be text. So the bottom line here is that we don't have much support yet for this proposition of social withdrawal, right? This is the good news part of my presentation. I'll get to the bad news part later. And then I also did, moving quickly, a literature review for the other contours, right? The other contours I mentioned are interacting with diverse ties, interacting with weak ties, and developing new ties. And so I dug through the literature, and initially I was just looking for any kind of empirical evidence that would support the argument of social withdrawal. So like if we had a study that said, well, I interact with my friends a lot via my mobile phone, and then linking that to decreased levels of weak ties, that would be in support of the argument. It would be consistent with the argument that mobile communication constrains our interactions outside of our core networks. And then I looked for evidence of the opposite, like I just presented to you, that mobile communication actually might support diverse, weak, and new ties. This would be exampled by a positive correlation between texting with your friends or interacting with your friends on the mobile phone and making new friends and developing new ties or weak ties or diverse ties. So this is everything except for the political part that I just presented. And then this third category showed up in my research, and this was the idea that, yeah, there's evidence that it's strengthening our core ties, but no evidence, even though there was an opportunity for it, no evidence of effects on diverse, weak, or new ties one way or the other. Just that it's strengthening our core ties. So if you think of like the scales, right? The argument from the social withdrawal perspective is that the scales of social interaction are being tipped like this. Core ties are being favored, zero-sum fashion, diverse, weak, and new ties, less, right? But this, the scale looks like this, core ties. And this one really isn't effective. And what I found is way more support, way more evidence that would be consistent with the idea that mobile communication supports either core ties and interactions with diverse, weak, or new ties, or structural conditions like I have more weak ties. It wasn't just behavioral, it was also structural. Or this overshadowed category where it's like, yeah, it's strengthening my core ties, or I have a lot of interactions with core ties. It's not really helping or hurting these other contours of social life. A little bit of evidence that it's really fascinating, this particular study right here, and I would love to unpack. I could probably spend a whole talk talking about just this study because it's really cool and I cherish my exceptions. This is an exception. There's consistent evidence for all of these things here. I'll just tell you that this is the only study compared to the rest that deals with our psychology towards people outside of our core networks. So these are attitudinal measures of how you think about diverse viewpoints, how you think about others that you don't know, how much you trust them, whether you're cautious of people in general, that kind of thing. The rest of these are about the structure of our social networks, right? How many diverse or weak ties we have, or our behavior, how often we interact with different types of people. So I think there's something there to explain that there might be a psychological cocooning effect here, but it doesn't show up in terms of the behavior or the structure. This one is mine, but it's the same study down here. It just depends on the social context. Sorry. This is a different study than the one I presented to you, but it's another case of it just depends on how we use the technology and who we use it with. But for the most part, I think what I'm trying to say is that mobile communication, the evidence so far, we're kind of looking at evidence that's consistent with the idea that there's more communication in our life in general, everywhere, especially within our core ties. By the way, this applies to both pre-smartphone and post-smartphone. Right? We see the same kinds of trends before smartphones and after smartphones. The tendency is favoring core ties, but not at the expense of others outside of our core ties. So, implications for social connection, which I think I just kind of covered. More social connection inside, more social connection outside, or in some cases, maybe at least not harmful effects outside. Okay, so we can say that there's more support for the added layer perspective, right, than the social withdrawal perspective so far. But, and this is what I'm trying to do in this project, I'm not trying to just identify theoretical streams and see how well they're supported. I'm trying to offer some critique of these theoretical streams. Although the evidence seems to support added layer, at least better than social withdrawal, I have a problem with one, or at least I want to offer a critique of one aspect of the added layer perspective. And that is the core assertion that it's not just an added layer, but that mobile communication is a newly added layer. I think this new, the part of the argument that says that it's new, they also use the words revolutionary, new and revolutionary. I don't think we're experiencing something that's new and revolutionary anymore. I don't think that the experiences that we have in our everyday lives with the technology right now is consistent with the idea that this is a new part of our lives. In other words, I think that what we're experiencing with mobile communication is the embedding of the technology, with it working its way maybe at once as something new, as my colleague Rich Ling would argue, but now something that's old hat, something that we just simply rely on, that's like second nature to us. And I think that's meaningful in a number of ways that I'm talking about. So that brings up the next theoretical stream that I'm working with, the embeddedness perspective. Here I'm drawing from Rich Ling, who had this great book come out in 2012 called Taken for Grantedness. He's a sociologist. He outlines these stages that the technology went through. For the sake of time, I'm not going to really unpack them, but I'll just tell you, this is kind of his system of analysis of how mobile communication went from the foreground of being something new and revolutionary to the background of our social structure as a basic expectation. The idea is that it's kind of like telling time, right? We expect everybody to be able to tell time. If you don't tell time, then you're going to kind of fall through the cracks of society, right? Like you can't go to a meeting because you don't know what time, you don't speak time, right? Mobile communication, he says, is like that, in that it's become ingrained in our social structure, a taken for granted expectation. And kind of the upshot of this at the end of it all, he says, is heightened expectations for accessibility to one another. That we don't see it, we don't feel it, we don't know it, it's kind of this unconscious thing, but it's part of our social structure, and that we're living in an age with heightened expectations of accessibility. That through patterns, uses, and routine and ritualistic uses that we've developed over time, we have come to rely on this as a core form of social mediation, much like transportation. We expect people to be able to get around. If you can't get around and you rely on everybody else to get around, you're a pain in their ass, right? I mean, you're not a fully functional member of society. If you don't tell time, you're a pain. If you don't have access to mobile technology, you're not just a pain, you're out of it, right? Here's the critique, though, from this perspective that I want to offer. My colleague Rich Ling is a sociologist, and sociologists are, of course, obsessed with social structure. So his entire argument is about the embedding of the technology in our social structure. He provides a number of illustrations and a number of areas of social structure: the family, work, personal relationships, romance, all of these areas where we have structured expectations of one another in how we're supposed to function, the roles we're supposed to play. And I think that we can take this a step further, and this is some work that actually my grad student sitting over here, Joe Baer, has exhibited a ton of intellectual leadership on, and so I want to make sure he gets credit for this work that we've been doing together. But that the argument here is that the technology has not just become embedded in our social structure, but it's also become embedded in our very selves, in our psychology, and how we think. Let me just read something from one of our papers that illustrates this argument. Just as mobile communication has shifted from a foreground artifact of attention to an embedded part of social structure, so too has it shifted from the foreground toward the background of cognitive processing. While this demonstrates a pattern of parallel movement across sociological and psychological fronts, mobile communication also intersects with the two fronts as a go-between in a chicken and egg cycle of mutual influence between social behavior and cognitive processing. It is this intersection between cognitive processing and social behavior that calls for an interdisciplinary framework that bridges psychological and sociological streams of theory. So Rich is just leaving it at sociology here, and we've been doing some work to push it into the realm of psychology while keeping it grounded in sociology. We're trying to bridge this gap, this disciplinary gap. And I'm calling it here the psychological embedding of mobile communication. There's a whole stream of, well, I shouldn't say a whole stream, but like this tiny little budding stream of what's known as cognitive sociology, where sociologists are also trying to kind of push in this direction and say it's not just about what's out there in our structure, but it's also about what's going on in here between the ears that helps. Like there's this kind of interplay between structure and cognition, and that the way that we think and also the way that we act shapes our social structure, and that in turn our social structure shapes how we think and how we act. We're due, and this is new idea, I'm not sure I'm actually going to go down this path in the project. Initially I think it might be fruitful. Bourdieu has this idea of habitus. Habitus is the idea of patterned behaviors that result in shared dispositions amongst people, and those dispositions in turn shape our behavior and shape our structure, right? And so I've got some quotes and stuff, but I see that we've got it's like 12:40, so I want to keep moving here and then let you ask me what I should dig in deeper to in a little bit. But I'm using this kind of as I guess a theoretical linchpin, and broader notions from cognitive sociology to make the argument that modal communication is not only embedded in our social structure, but it's also embedded in our psychology, and that this matters. We can see evidence of this, and also an explanation of how this matters when I talk about this a little bit. But there's two things I just want to present today as illustrations of this. One of them, very, very briefly, is the notion of the phantom vibration. How many of you have ever experienced a phantom vibration? Pretty much everybody. You feel your phone, right? You feel that thing buzzing in your pocket or in your purse, and you check it and you're like, oh crap. It didn't even, what am I thinking? I think this is evidence of the link, the cognitive link, and it's latent. It's kind of this unconscious thing, right? Like we are sort of unconsciously plugged in through the technology, right? We're unconsciously plugged in, not just through the technology to other people, but also to the technology itself, to the extent that we're reacting to it when it's not even going off. We're ready for it at any time. It's like that switch is on, but we're not thinking about it, right? That's psychological embedding. Texting while driving. We've done some research on this, and I think this is reflective of the psychological embedding in the technology. So Joe and I, but Joe as lead author, identified a problem when he first came to graduate school, and the problem was that we're in this age of heightened awareness. People know they shouldn't text and drive, but they're still doing it. What's the explanation for it? We notice there's tons of solutions out there. There's laws, there's billboards, there's media campaigns, there's apps, right? But if you look at the numbers, at least at the time that we were doing this, I haven't looked at them this year or anything, they were kind of hanging in there pretty steady, right? The problem wasn't going away. So we felt like, okay, these solutions need to be better informed with an explanation of why. Why do people text and drive, right? And so we dug into the research, and really what Joe was finding here was that a lot of the research was framed by the theory of planned behavior, right? Conscious decision-making, conscious awareness of our attitudes, conscious awareness of the norms, the perceived norms, perceived behavioral control. Theory of planned behavior said that, it says that our actions are kind of guided by our conscious cognitive processing along these lines, and so we created a measure of texting automaticity in general. These are some examples of items from the measure. And it's an overall orientation towards texting. Is it something that you really do without thinking? And if you think about it, this makes sense, right? If your phone goes off, whoever's phone just went off, you probably just immediately, we do that. And I think a lot of people today, it's not just responding to the phone, also responding to our emotions. Like, we have an experience, and we want to share that experience with somebody else. Like, oh man, there's a dead raccoon. The first thing you do is pull out your phone. I went to this monkey jungle one time, and I got behind the scenes because our friends knew the owners. It's in Miami. And you got to actually interact with monkeys, and I was in a group of 6 or 7 people. The first thing we did, as all these little spider monkeys were crawling all over us, like a once-in-a-lifetime experience, we all automatically pulled out our phones to start taking pictures and to start taking video. The whole experience was mediated through the phone. We weren't thinking about what we were doing. We couldn't help ourselves. We were like, this is the first thing I'm going to do now that I'm having this experience, right? Texting while driving, we found, is significantly and reasonably strongly, if you look at the effect sizes here, partially explained by this measure of having an automatic orientation towards the phone, right? So the technology is cognitively embedded, right? This is an example of how it plays out in everyday life, but it's also an explanation for a major, major problem that we're experiencing on the roads today. It's a public safety hazard. Chances of an accident go up some say 1,200% if you pull out your cell phone. Some say it's even more than that. It's ridiculous. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, implications for solitude. I'm kind of interested in solitude these days. It's definitely an understudied thing. It's not something that everybody needs more of, that's for sure. There's a lot of older folks out there that have 48% of their waking time in solitude, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of young people, there's a lot of busy adults, adults with children. The numbers are way down, right? The time that they get to spend by themselves. First, I want to point out a problem with solitude. Not only do we have a problem with solitude because of mobile communication that I'm arguing, first of all, we have a problem with solitude because it's conceptualized in an era before mobile communication, before we have any time, anywhere access to other people. Here's the Oxford English Dictionary. The state of being or living alone. All right? This implies physical co-presence with somebody else. There's a classic book by this guy named Anthony Storr. He's a psychoanalyst in Britain. And he wrote this book in 1988, before internet mobile phones really kind of hit the scene, right? Called Solitude, A Return to Self. He's conceptualizing it in a lot of different ways. Being alone physically, lacking close relationships with others, not getting married or cohabitating. And he's saying that all of this stuff can be totally fine, depending on the person. He's saying that sometimes we need more of this stuff. But my problem is that, like, look at how this concept is, and this is in psychology. This is one of the standard measurements of solitude. I enjoy being around people. I like to vacation in places where there are few people around. If we were to take a several-hour plane trip, I would like to sit next to someone who was pleasant to talk with. Some of these are reverse worded, right? So this all either explicitly or implicitly implies physical co-presence, right? So these come from psychology or psychoanalysis. I'd like to offer a communication. I'm in communication studies. What is communication? To me, very simple. The creation of meaning. We create meaning with other people through social interaction. Make sense of our social world so that we can navigate it. From a communication perspective, I'd like to offer a new conceptualization of solitude that's rooted not in being physically alone, but in social interaction, not interacting with other people, which opens the door for thinking about mediated connections being real, which I think we all have seen literature that suggests that what we're doing online these are real connections, right? So I think we need to rethink solitude from a communication perspective. I think we need to consider the possibility that when we're connecting with our cell phone, we're not alone. I think we need to consider the possibility that even if we just have the cell phone on us, the mobile phone on us, and turned on, that the quality of our solitude is affected by that because of the phantom vibrations, right? And the psychological embedding, that we are ready to be interrupted at any time, right? We're ready for that link to be activated at any time. I think for true solitude, we might need to actually turn the phone off, right? Or put it somewhere else so that we're cognitively shutting that link down. Also, one of the points I'm going to kind of end on here is that what's the importance of solitude? If you value solitude, not that everybody needs more of it in their lives, but that because of the anytime, anywhere nature of the technology, and the fact that we can not be alone if we, at any point in time. Sometimes it's not up to us. Sometimes it's people beckoning us, and sometimes it's us beckoning them. But my point is that we have these moments of unplanned solitude that we experience. Maybe you're in a grocery store and you're just having some thoughts to yourself, right? You're not planning on that. Or maybe just you find some moments where you're by yourself. Those unplanned moments are certainly getting eaten away at by mobile communication because of the anytime, anywhere nature of it. Therefore, my argument is that we need to think about the deliberate solitude that we also have, and that we need to carve out more spaces for that, deliberately, because the undeliberate solitude is kind of going away, right? And finally, I want to recognize the fact that I'm not the only person that's thinking about these things. Sherry Turkle, very controversial figure in new media circles. I don't agree with everything that she has to say or the way that she goes about doing her work, but she had a book came out like October 6th, so I'm just working through it now. I've read the part on solitude, and she's making this point too, but she's making it in a different way. She thinks the explanation for why we're perpetually connected with people through mobile technologies is because of boredom, an internal state. I'll agree with some of that, and because of a fear to interact with other people face to face. Maybe, I don't know. But my point is that there's something else going on here that she's not talking about in her book. That this embedding, this sociological embedding into our social structure and the psychological embedding into ourself, right? I think these are the explanations for why we're perpetually, or additional explanations for why we're perpetually connected. And that coming out of these explanations, I think we can sort of raise our awareness of the need for heightening our deliberate solitude, considering our undeliberate solitude moments are kind of going away. And for those of you who know me personally, or Paul Resnick will appreciate this, I just wanted to dedicate this talk in memory of Bill Keith, who died on Friday, and sort of developed a melodic style banjo playing. Thank you. Questions or comments? Stephanie?
So when you did your literature review looking for papers that were supportive or not supportive about this idea about whether it's good or not good to be constantly connected, it looked from the list of people like you stayed pretty much in the communication realm? Because I'm thinking about studies, and honestly I have to go find references for you about college students, about some studies that have shown that students who remain tightly connected to their high school friends when they come to college don't make as many new friends in college.
Right.
So I don't know.
That would be, so I had some criteria. One of my criteria was that it had to be about mobile communication. There had to be mobile communication variables in there. So if you had any of that research that included mobile phone use with those ties.
It's more like Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah,
So this was a mobile, I was kind of swimming in the mobile waters here.
Yeah.
And you had to have an opportunity. I interpreted frequency of text messaging as a proxy for how much you're texting your four ties, because we don't text the pizza guy very much, you know. So, right, yeah. And then it also had to include some of those other outcomes like weak ties, diverse ties. Let's talk more though, because I want to expand this.
Yeah.
My lit review had I found maybe 22 things that were relevant at the time. I need to expand. Yeah.
Yeah, go to the slide about how mobile affects the strong or weak ties relationships.
Yeah.
You said it really depends sort of on context, or you said how and who we use it with.
Yes.
Can you speak to maybe some of the salient contextual variables
Yes,
there? I think
yes,
that'd be
let me
really
just-
interesting to us as also a lot of designers here.
Yes. So this one right here, this study right here looked at patterns of mobile phone use and linked those patterns to having conversations with strangers in public. And the three patterns that we, narrowed the scope down to three things. Recreational use of the technology, using it for fun, play games, using it for any type of news or public affairs, right? And using it to interact socially with other people, all right? So what we found is that over time, people who used it to interact socially with other people and then there was an interaction effect with using it in public spaces in general. So how much do you use the phone in general to interact with other people? How much do you use the phone in general in public spaces? They interacted together to predict less conversations with strangers. So that's the context of use, is you're talking to your friends, right? You're cut off from strangers because you're talking to your friends. Now, if you use the mobile phone a lot for news and information, there's an interaction there with use in public settings where it leads to, believe it or not, increased conversations with strangers. And my explanation for that is you've got public affairs, right? This is relevant information not just to you, but to other people. So if you're reading and consuming some information that's relevant to the public in general, you've got some fodder to talk about with somebody that you don't know, right? Maybe it's about the weather. I don't know. Maybe there's a hurricane coming, and you're like, hey man, did you see there's a hurricane coming? At Starbucks or something. So that's the context of use. And then the study I showed before with the three-way interaction effects was illustrating the part about who you use it with, right? So if you use it with a large set of like-minded close ties, you're more likely to be politically engaged. If you use it with a very small set of like-minded core ties, you're less likely to be politically engaged, a little bit. And so the point there is that that depends on the nature of your social network in which you use the phone.
Were you asserting a causal tie there, or is that just a correlation?
Yeah, in both of these cases, I'm asserting a causal tie because I have, to the extent that you can assert causality with longitudinal survey data. Other questions? Yep.
What's the difference between just deliberate solitude and unplugging as it's generally perceived in society?
And unplugging?
Unplugging.
Well, if you unplug because you dropped your phone in the toilet, that's not deliberate. If you unplug because you want to go to the arm and go for a drink, that's deliberate. That's carving out space for yourself. So I would say it's probably a matter of semantics. I would use the phrase unplug to characterize deliberate solitude. You choose to turn your phone off.
But you can think of also there being two types of unplugging, right? Like social, like you could unplug and interact with people face to face, which is an open housement, or unplug and do solitude. So I guess that's
Oh yeah, in mine it would be not interacting with people face to face or in a mediated context.
So that might be one of the major differences between what you're talking about and what generally society talks about when they say unplug.
Right, yeah, I'm not, yeah, so okay, unplugging, I'm talking about any kind of social interaction for solitude. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I guess just following on that, this strikes me as relevant to the laptops in classrooms debate, right? I mean, obviously a portable technology, and but this idea of being available and being kind of persistently distracted or available for communication. And I wonder if this was part of what you would look at all in this, or do you see it relevant?
Not really. I mean, only in the sense that I'm arguing that laptops are used in a portable context. Mobile phones are used in a portable context, but that they can be used in a mobile context. Theoretically, laptops could too. I never see people cruising around and paying for their ice cream while they're like on their laptop, So it's a process thing. But no, I mean, for better or for worse, like the project that I'm working on here is something that I contracted for a book with Oxford, and they're doing a series on studies in mobile communication. My definition of mobile communication, which differs from most scholars, doesn't include things that can only be portable. And so for that reason, I'm really zeroing in on the process of and the availability of anytime, anywhere content.
Well, I guess what I was suggesting is that the cognitive embedding of the expectation that you're always available for communication might be a big drag. Because I think there's a lot of, the physical laptop isn't really the problem.
Right.
It's the affordances of what it can enable, right? And so I was
and the
just struck by that.
expectations.
The expectations, right?
Right.
And the idea that it can't be offline, and that if somebody, messages me, I need to respond. And
Yeah, this is a really good point. This is something that I'm thinking through right now. The way I'm seeing it initially is that we've got, I think what you're saying is this larger phenomenon of expectations of accessibility.
Right.
And that those expectations play out through our engagement with these things and other things and face-to-face. And what I'm arguing is that it plays out distinctively, that this piece of the puzzle, this mobile situation, is distinctive in these ways, and therefore is worthy of some attention, but it's not all on its own. It's definitely part of the larger mix.
But if my two high schoolers are right, that's the distinction between the laptop and the mobile is going away, because the high school kids don't bring their laptops, but according to my kids, their cell phones are hidden in their lap.
Okay.
And they're doing a lot of what we would be doing on the laptop, on their mobile phone in class.
We see that in Korea, actually,
Yeah.
a lot, too. It depends culturally, yeah. I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Do you think the emergence of wearable technology will kind of change the nature of mobile communication, or do you think it's going to do you think having a mobile device on your wrist doesn't really just changes the location of where it is it's supposed to be?
Pejja tells me it's not a life-changing event, but I asked him in the elevator a few weeks ago. He's like, you know what, it didn't change my life. He's got the Apple Watch or whatever. I don't think it changes my definition of mobile communication at all. That's why I define it in this process and possibility way, because I do see us moving towards more and more form factors. Google Glass hasn't taken off, but something else could. And I think, it'll have its own distinctive flavor in how we experience mobile communication. I don't know, I dodge this kind of question all the time because I think of myself as a social scientist, so I'm trying to explain how and why things happen, which is a convenient excuse for not predicting the future. Right? So, Gary, you had
Yeah. Going back to that for 1 second, we do have a chapter on Google Glass which talks about how it shortens the cognitive links even further when there's less cognitive work that has to go into using technology. And so if it's more wearable and more visually oriented, it might make some of these links even stronger.
more subjectively part of who you are as a person.
The other question I had was, so I think Jeremy Bernholz at Northwestern has some work on, or at least theoretical work on the idea of designing for disconnection. And so you sort of put the argument out that you need to really turn the phone off in order to enact solitude.
Right.
But under the right design conditions, do you think it's possible to have these situations where have the phone still on you, but not necessarily notifying you?
Yeah, I mean, I have mine off. I mean, don't we have that now with like vibrate off and sound off?
Yeah, I think the idea is that it's not that effective right now, but it could be.
Okay. You mean other ways of making it effective?
Yeah.
The design itself.
Right.
If you can get the design side of it, do that.
Right. Maybe. I don't know. This is something I need to definitely give some more thought into. Nikki and Ryan also has a question, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but I guess I'm just wondering how much of the lack of solitude is about the messages coming in versus the expectation that you'll respond.
Yeah.
Is it just that is that something fundamentally different, or is it just kind of like degrees of interaction?
Right. I don't know.
Because if I got messages, but somehow there was a message that went out that said she's not available to write back.
Yeah.
Is that more? Does
think it
that
would
count
help.
as solitude?
I think it would help. Yeah.
Do you put your vacation agent on when you're gone on your email?
I don't.
Ah.
I think that there's two dimensions of solitude at least. One of them is quantity, how much solitude do you get, and that's what gets measured in the research.
Yeah.
And the other one I think you're getting at here is quality.
Yeah.
The quality of your
Exactly.
solitude. And I think you're talking about degrees of quality, probably. That's how I see it. Initially. This is new stuff. I mean, I just started reading about solitude like 3 weeks ago. So. Right.
I had a quick comment. I think airplane mode for me has been very effective in cutting off all.
Yeah, me
like
too.
right now, it's in airplane mode. I turn it off when I walk in, because otherwise, like the notifications and everything, it just completely distracts you from the present moment.
But it raises an interesting point. Like even that, so I actually don't have airplane mode on now. I have my vibrate off and then sound off, right? So anybody who calls me, right? Some people still call me, is going to know that my phone is off, right? And I'm going to feel the expectation to respond maybe sooner because of that. Whereas airplane mode is more effective maybe in cutting off those expectations, because if somebody at least calls you, they'll know that your phone's off. And who knows when it's going to be turned back on.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue into my question, is like the expectation of availability and its correlation to stress. Because as I sit here, I'm thinking about, in the back of my mind, the stress that is building up, the number of text messages and or emails and or phone calls.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to respond to it 1:30 when we're done with this conversation.
Yeah. So solitude can relieve you from stress and then create more stress when you come out of it, I guess.
Perhaps,
To catch up on your
to
social.
catch up, or an obligation is available.
Yeah.
Obligation.
She's been very patient.
Sorry, just to add to that, most of these applications these days are built to heighten the expectation, like the availability is shown.
Read, receive.
Read, receive is online, offline, so that kind of sets the expectation. So the design is moving towards the expectation when we all know it's bad. So I'd like your take on why it's happening, because none of us personally would like it, but the affordances of the application are tending in that direction.
Right. And why are they designing it that way?
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, I could say that they think that they're catering to what we think we need or want, or I could maybe make this kind of critical argument that that they're trying to make us more dependent and they're trying to tighten that vicious cycle. Yeah. That's a good question. A lot of this stuff I don't know. I'm just starting to think about some of this stuff. Okay, well, do we have time for one more, or are we done?
Let's stop now because it's past 1.
Okay.
But let's thank Scott.